2023 is set to be a historic year for India as the country gears up to host the G20 summit for the first time in September. There are 9 months to go to the mega event, but preparations have already begun. The first Sherpa meeting is underway in Udaipur, and I caught up with India's chief G20 coordinator and former Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla, began by asking him about the message that India is sending out.
Well, today is the first G20 meeting, and as such is the start of, I would say, what is going to be a magnificent presidency for India. What you see here, as you mentioned, are the Sherpas of different countries, the G20 countries from all over the world. And today we had initial comments from them on the broad priorities that we had outlined for our presidency. I think the sense I got was that there is a lot of support, very strong support from each and every member country of the G20 for our agenda and for our presidency. There was many of them expressed the desire to work closely with us in achieving our objectives. I think there was a strong sense that the broad priorities we outlined, which were outlined by Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji at Bali at the Indonesia summit, those were discussed at some length today, and we got initial feedback from many of the delegations. So I think it's looking very good. Right. As you know, there will be several rounds of discussions, and I'm sure that our presidency will be a very memorable and unique one.
Sir, I'd also like to ask you, we believe that India is proposing a Green Development Pact. What does that really entail, and what would we want G20 nations to do?
Well, green development, as we see it, is a very broad concept which encompasses everything from environment and the concept of lifestyle for environment, sustainable consumption, to climate action and climate justice. And the SDGs, fulfillment of the SDGs, I think, is an important part of this plank. So it is, I would say, a very broad approach to the issues of sustainable development, to the issues of lifestyle for environment, to the issue of climate change, how to address the issues of climate change. So I think there's a lot broad traction for that concept, and as I said, this is only the first day, and we're going to have many more meetings. But today is a very significant day because, as you can see, all the Sherpas are out in Rajasthani traditional dress, and this is, I think, in keeping with our endeavor to present an impeccably and uniquely Indian presidency.
Yeah. My final two questions, sir. The finance track, as and when it takes place, what would be the key priority there from India's side?
Well, the finance track is not completely separate from the Sherpa track. I think all of the tracks move together. The broad priorities apply to all tracks. So finance is considering their areas. It is finance and sustainable development. It is finance and green development. It is finance and technology transformation. So the priorities remain the same. Finance track looks at it from a financial perspective, and wherever there are issues that relate to either financing of these activities or what it means in terms of macroeconomic stability, that finance ministry comes in that, and the finance track comes in. But the Sherpa track is also working on the same deliverables in a more broad sense.
And finally, sir, would it be right to say that India is trying to see if emerging economies can have a greater say in the G20 decision-making, and it's not just about the G7?
Well, you have a unique conjuncture of four emerging economies holding G20 presidency in a row. We had Indonesia, which just completed its presidency. After us, we Brazil, and then South Africa. So there is the opportunity for a strong development agenda. As our Prime Minister has mentioned that, in many senses, India is the voice of the global South. I mean, developing countries look to India to give aspiration to to give voice to their aspirations. And this is what we intend to do. And I think it will be, from that perspective, as the Prime Minister said, an ambitious, bold and result-oriented presidency where we will deliver for priorities for the developing world, but we will work with everybody in doing so.
There is also some implicit tension, as one diplomat described it, over the war. Russia says that it is the sanctions which are causing a slowdown in the economy, not the war itself. How will India build consensus when there is so much of tension and division over the war?
So, as I said, the G20 is a normative body which looks at broadly macroeconomic priorities, financial issues concerning the globe. And our endeavor is to bridge gaps wherever they exist, and bring countries together on the larger agenda of the day, which is global priorities for everybody, not just us, but the entire world.
All right, so that was the Chief G20 Coordinator for India, Harshvardhan Shringla, in conversation with me at Udaipur. I also caught up with Germany's Sherpa, Jörg Kukies, at the Sherpa gathering in Udaipur. He's also the State Secretary of State for Financial Market Policy and European Policy. I began by asking him about how difficult would it be for the German and the European economy in the next few months as they head for a harsh winter.
Well, I think we surprised everyone because we started in December, almost a year ago, to plan for exactly this eventuality that ended up happening, namely Russia violating all of its contracts and stopping the supply of gas. But we're well prepared. We have 98% of our storage capacity filled. So despite the fact that prices are painfully high, the German economy is still coping with the problem much better than was anticipated by many experts.
How would you describe the mood in the room when the G20 Sherpas met for the first time today?
Well, I mean, we were all still quite happy that the Bali summit under the Indonesian presidency ended with a strong statement, which was a condemnation of Russia, which called the war that Russia is waging a war, which said that most countries strongly condemned the war. So in that sense, there was still quite good acknowledgement that the Indonesian presidency did such an outstanding job at bringing everyone together.
I'd like to ask you about Chancellor Olaf Scholz's statement earlier today that we must not make the mistake of stopping dialogue or stopping trying to have a dialogue with President Putin. He spoke on the phone to the Russian president. What would you propose to other G20 Sherpas as far as speaking to and bringing the Russians to the negotiating table?
Well, I won't make any recommendations to anyone else. I can just say that the Chancellor, throughout the war, has had a very strong condemnation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, but he has maintained the dialogue with the Russian president on humanitarian issues, on the issue of the export of fertilizers, of grains, of humanitarian support. So in that sense, having the dialogue is something that is well coordinated within the G7 and within the partner countries.
Right. The price cap, the importance of the price cap for other nations as well. Clearly an attempt to keep the flow of oil going, keep it at affordable rates, at the same time impact Russia's ability to fight the war.
Yes, you've answered the question yourself. That's exactly the purpose, and it's a great sign of unity that the G7 and now the European Union has endorsed this. And
But Russia is talking about countermeasures.
Well, that's normal, I would say. That's not new either. So in that sense, that's to be expected.
About the pace of sanctions, there is concern among emerging economies about how these sanctions are hurting economic growth, the fiscal space that the developing economies have. Do you share this view that maybe we need to have a relook at the sanctions?
Well, you always have to go to the core cause of the problem, and the G20 statement is very clear in naming the Russian aggression against Ukraine as the core root and cause of the problem. And then we've taken great care in all of the design of the sanctions not to sanction food, not to sanction fertilizers. So in that sense, the core essence of the cause of the problem is clearly on the Russian side.
Right. And my final question, if I were to ask you about one unfinished agenda from Bali on the economic front, which now needs to be addressed over the next 9 months, what would that be?
Well, we're dealing with a lot of situations with high debt, the interest rate changes, the foreign exchange market changes, the high debt levels going into this crisis, which have only increased, shows in several countries already that debt is becoming a problem, and the G20 have to work together either under the common framework or other parameters, the Paris Club and many of the fora that we've agreed on to collaboratively solve these problems.
All right, it's a wrap on this edition of News Center. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.